Hello viewers, welcome to week 1, lecture 1 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University. We will be elaborating on various aspects of the given topic. So, before we start our lecture, I would like to tell you that what is the rationale behind the choice of this course and how I have developed this paper. So, if we look at the body of literary criticism and theory, it is very vast. It starts from the classical Greek age and comes to the current times. It is still developing as a discourse, as an area of study, as a discipline. However, in that vast field, I have chosen only that part which has developed during the 20th century. And even in that 20th century, I have focused particularly on the formalistic approaches to literature. So I have left out the interdisciplinary or non-formalistic approaches to literature and focus on approaches to literature which focus on text with a special use of language, and we will find that how these approaches are primarily focusing on the dimension of language, the form of writing, the style of writing. To some extent, content is given a secondary position in the analysis of these things. So therefore, they are called formalistic approaches to literature. I am not saying that content is totally neglected or altogether avoided, but what I want to say that in these approaches, form is projected, that is foregrounded, and content is something that is kept secondary in analysis. So, we can understand that when we talk about the development of literary theory and criticism in the 20th century, it all starts with the critical opinions, concepts and speculations of three major critics, that is T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards and F.R. Lewis. They are the bridges between the 19th century and the 20th century, and thereafter we see that how under their influence new criticism emerges. Russian formalism is another movement which developed in the first decade of the 20th century and second decade of the 20th century, but somehow this movement was developing in Russia, and for some regions it remained unknown to its European counterpart for quite a longer time. Only in the 1950s we find that people largely come to know about this entire movement. So therefore I have kept it at that position. Then we find the development of structuralism under the leadership of Ferdinand de Saussure. Then we find the development of post-structuralism, which is often called a critique of structuralism, which developed under the leadership of Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher. We will also be talking about reader response criticism and other dimensions which go into the making of reader response criticism, such as hermeneutics, reception theory. We will also be talking about semiotics, stylistics and speech act theory. So before, so I have delineated that what are the components that I am going to discuss in the 20th century literary criticism and theory. Now let us come to the title of this lecture. For example, you will feel that the words criticism and theory, sometimes they are used interchangeably. Sometimes people use them with a sense as if there is no distinction between criticism and theory. Sometimes, the Platonic criticism or Aristotelian criticism, neoclassical criticism, romantic criticism, or Victorian criticism, what we can say, they all are sometimes treated as theories. For example, Romantic theory of literature, Classical theory of literature. And at the same time, we find that many approaches, for example, post-colonialism or deconstruction or Marxism, they are also called criticism. They are also known as Marxist criticism, feminist criticism. So the fact is that that's true, that these words are used interchangeably. However, I feel that there is a subtle distinction between the two approaches. So, in this lecture, I will be talking about the origin of the word criticism, various meanings of the word criticism, or what we mean by this discipline or this area called literary criticism, what are the activities involved in this area. And at the same time, I will also be making a subtle distinction between criticism and theory that we have to keep in our mind while we are undertaking this course. So that is what I seek to cover in this first lecture. So let us start about the origin of the word criticism, or origin of this term as well as this activity. So etymologically speaking, the word criticism comes from the Greek word kritikos, which means judge or discerner. It is derived from the word krino, which means to judge, to separate, or to distinguish. So one thing becomes very clear, that criticism as an act emerges as an activity of judgment. Now, what is this act of judgment? Usually this act of judgment involves rewarding someone or something because of its merit, punishing or criticizing something for its demerits. So we can understand that criticism becomes an activity in which we talk about the merits as well as we talk about the demerits of a work of art. So in that way, you can understand the etymology of the word criticism. So far as Latin root of criticism, it comes from the word criticus. Criticus also means a judge, a censor, an estimator. So the role of judge, criticism as an activity of judgment, I have already talked about. A censor, that is a word in which, what is not up to the mark will not be acknowledged. Or estimator, it means a kind of evaluation, estimation of a work of art. If we look at the French origin of the word, which comes from the word critique, as we can say, so it is also having a similar meaning, that is one who passes judgment, or a person skilled in judging merit in some particular class of things. So taking all these things together, we can say that literary criticism is an activity in which the works of art or literary text are judged, evaluated, compared with other works of art, in context of other works of art, and in this way they are appreciated for their merits, they are criticized for their demerits. As we can see, that criticism is a process or is an activity which involves examining, evaluating, and judging something in a systematic and reasoned manner. It involves analyzing its strengths, weaknesses, implications, and formulating an informed opinion or assessment. Right. If we look at Greek society, like when we talk about criticism, we often start it with Plato. Plato's Republic or the Ion. These are the texts which are, considered to be the beginnings of the literary criticism in the West. However, in general, the concept of criticism originated in ancient Greece, where it was closely associated with philosophy and rhetoric. Greek philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle emphasized the importance of critical thinking and the use of logic and reason to examine ideals and beliefs. So, one thing becomes very clear, that literary criticism is an activity of evaluating works of art in a given context. It is discussing their merits and demerits. So, this is one shade of the meaning or the idea of literary criticism. What we mean by that, that is criticism of work of art. The other activity which is integral to this act of literary criticism is the act of interpretation, right? So, interpretation, how literary criticism started as an interpretation of something. So, since the times immemorial, we can say that literary criticism originated in religious practices as well as in the ordinary practices. Like in Greek society, there used to be oracles. Oracles were, creatures endowed with a vision into future. They were endowed with a foresight. So, they were capable of looking into the future of things. And oracle often, for example, the oracle of Delphi. So, they often made some statements about individuals, and individuals were frantic after the interpretation of those messages uttered by the oracle. So, we can say that this act of interpretation is itself, at the basis of what is called literary criticism. So far as religious contexts are concerned, we can say that interpretation of literary text, for example, often you find that in the literary text like the Bible, in the religious text like the Bible, of course they are literary as well, or the Quran, because they all are composed in poetry. So anyway, in these religious texts we find that the messages of gods and prophets are there, and people are there to interpret those messages. So you can say that the development of this entire body of religion is somehow there for the purpose of interpretation of texts, right? And in this way we can say that these texts were thought to contain encoded information that could only be recovered through explicatory practices, which were often called hermeneutics. So, hermeneutics means explication of these religious texts. The task of a critic is to decode the message which is there in those literary texts. We can also talk about another origin of this activity of literary criticism. That is its legal origin. Legal origin in the context that, legal texts are there and they also need interpretation in particular context and in particular cases. So, the body of literature is totally dependent on this act of criticism. And then we find that, legal discourse so also had a strong impact on the foundations of textual studies, and legal texts are often inaccessible and require interpretation with regard to a specific situation. So, in a way, we have been able to look at the origin of literary criticism, the definition of literary criticism, and various activities which have gone into the making of this discipline called literary criticism, right? And 3-4 major tools we can understand what are the tools of literary criticism. So, one is judgment, analysis, evaluation, comparison, and interpretation. So, these 5 tools, make literary criticism possible or make literary criticism take place. So we can say that literary criticism is a discipline concerning the purpose and applicability of literary interpretation, a number of theoretical trends and methodological approaches to have a more advanced sense of literary criticism. So we can say that literary studies are characterized by a plethora of approaches and methodologies, right? So you can say that literary criticism in a way becomes an eclectic kind of approach. And later on when we talk about literary theory, so it is truly eclectic in nature because it draws from various other disciplines, various other sources. So we can say that whereas literary criticism deals with the analysis and evaluation of primary text, literary theory seeks to shed light on the very methods used in those readings. For example, to understand it in simple way, we can say that literary criticism may be taken as the analysis, interpretation, evaluation, comparison of literary texts, and literary theory talks about various standards, approaches and methods which are used in analysis, interpretation, evaluation and making judgment. So that is how one way we can understand this distinction between literary criticism and theory. Well, if we talk about this term theory, we can see that largely during the 1960s, this discipline, literary theory, becomes more philosophical in nature. It is deriving, various methodologies from different kinds of disciplines. For example, deriving from anthropology, deriving from mythical criticism, deriving from psychology, deriving from sociology, deriving from gender studies, deriving from class studies, race studies, etc., etc. So we can say that the development of theory in which standards of literature and approaches to literature are theorized in a way. This theorization is something that takes place during the 1960s, especially when we see, for example, Terry Eagleton's Literary Theory and Introduction. That is very important work in which he elaborates this idea of literary theory. So, I mean, that is one way, but we can see that criticism and theory, very nuanced distinction is there between literary criticism and theory. For example, we see that whenever particular texts are explicated, right, so that becomes an activity of literary criticism. Often literary criticism is understood to be a sort of engagement with particular text. But when we are talking about literary theory, we are talking about theory in general, right? Speculations about literature in general. So that is called literary theory. Again, when we talk about criticism, so criticism is something that is empirical in nature. So it is about analyzing various aspects of literature in a very concrete terms, right? For example, if we take the example of a poem, so in a poem, the use of imagery, the use of symbolism, the use of tone, so all these things are discussed, which make the empirical data of that text, and that comes in the ambit of criticism. So far as theory is concerned, so often we find that when we move from these concrete things, when we move from the analysis of these concrete things towards abstractions, so it becomes part of theory, right? So from the discussion of all those things, suppose we move to the ideological dimensions of a text, that what could be the sociology behind the making of this poem, what could be the philosophical idea behind writing this poem, what could be the political implications about these things. So whenever these questions are starting, right? So questioning various assumptions, that comes in the ambit of theory, that is in the ambit of speculation, right? So far as criticism is concerned, we find that it is explication of the text, or whatever author's message is there, whatever his point of view is there, all these things are implicated or explicated. That activity often is understood as part of criticism. But whenever we go into the making of conceptualization, whenever we move from the critical analysis of these terms towards conceptualizing certain terms, we are moving into the area of literary theory, right? For instance, certain concepts which are not related particularly to the text or particularly to that message of the author, they are seen in a larger context. They are seen in vast historical context or social context. In that way, here individual writings are merely illustrations. They are seen in a broader framework, and in a way some general theories are evolved, right? When we talk about criticism and theory, we can also understand this distinction in terms of analyzing intrinsic features of literature and analyzing extrinsic features of literature. For example, when we talk about intrinsic features of literature, so we can say that a poem is given on the page, right? So whatever dimensions are there that you can see, you can analyze, you can talk about that. So that is called intrinsic, features of a text. While when we talk about theory, it may be outside the text, right? It may talk about the affiliations, various kinds of affiliations of the text. So that is also a difference between criticism and theory that we can say. So in a way, we can say that when within literary studies, literary theory is a distinct discipline influenced by philosophy. So philosophy plays an important role. But again, as I told you, that if you look at the origin of literary criticism, it all was started by philosophers. So there again, this distinction between literary criticism and theory is blurred, and many times they overlap. And in that way, I think people are justified in using these two terms, criticism and theory, interchangeably. Approaches to literary texts are characterized by a number of divergent ways, right? Then we see literary interpretations always reflect a particular institutional, cultural, and historical background. So we can say that this act of criticism is never an innocent activity, right? And when we move into that direction, there you find that this criticism is often taken as a theory, in which this activity is taken to be an act which has already some preconceived notions, right? So no criticism of text, no analysis of text, no interpretation of text, no evaluation of text can be purely objective. So whenever this dimension of subjectivity is emphasized in this field of literary criticism, we can say that that moves towards or tilts towards literary theory. All right. So literary theory analyzes the philosophical and methodological premises of literary criticism. Right. We can also say that this literary theory thus functions as the theoretical and philosophical consciousness of textual studies, constantly reflecting on its own development and methodology. So we can say that when literary criticism perhaps goes beyond the act of criticizing or explicating a text, and it becomes self-reflexive. It starts thinking about its own status, how it has itself developed as a discourse. There we can say that criticism becomes theory, and there is a very thin line that is dividing the two. So, dear viewers, with this point, I come to the end of the first lecture of this first week of this course on 20th century literary criticism and theory, part 1. In this course, I did three things majorly. First of all, I defined that what are the areas that I am going to discover in this course, that are formalistic approaches to literature. Secondly, I talked about the origins of literary criticism, various shades of meaning and definitions of literary criticism. The third point that I primarily did, that what is distinction between criticism and theory. So, the subtle distinction between the two has been elaborated in this lecture, and criticism and theory are often used interchangeably, because if we look at them, then criticism is theory and theory is criticism in that way. So, having done that, in the next lecture, I'll be talking about particularly various approaches to literary criticism and theory in the 20th century. Thank you for viewing this, and I hope that it is going to be an enlightening and entertaining journey for us.